stop. If you think help is coming, you're already behind. The world doesn't end all at once. It breaks, piece by piece, system by system, until nothing holds. Power fails. Communications go silent. Supply chains choke and die. And the people waiting for someone to fix it realize no one is coming. This is the story of the Smith family, a normal American family forced into a world that doesn't care about normal. No perfect decisions, only consequences. Everything you hear is fiction, but the way it unfolds isn't. Survival Dispatch Remnant. The world ended, they did. Season 1, Episode 14, Part 2. Daniel Reeves. Segment 5. The hallway came apart into noise and motion in the space of a single breath. Thomas fired again through the inside wall, blind, and the round punched high and buried itself in a roof joist and rained grit down over all of them. The two boys who had surrendered came up off the floor at the sound like flushed birds and bolted, not toward the team and not toward the threat, straight down the hallway and out into the gray morning, gone, and nobody reached for them. There was nothing in any hand on that floor worth a frightened child's life, and there was not 1 second to spend on the reaching. Move them, Mark said, and it was not loud, and it carried anyway. He put his own body between the kept and the blanket-hung doorway and pushed them toward the east door with the flat of his hand. The mother and the child, the older woman, the thin man, the two who had stopped counting days. Sarah took the head of the line and pulled, and Jake set his shoulder hard into the corner that covered the hallway and put his eyes down the AR's sights and held there, because a man who guards the corner does not get to look at anything but the corner. John went to a knee in the center of the floor with the scoped rifle up and steady, the one still point in a room gone to pieces, and he waited the half second it took the thing behind the wall to become a target instead of a sound. It became a target. The blanket tore aside, and Brother Thomas came through it with a rifle already at his shoulder and his face still creased from the bunk and murder plain in the set of his mouth. A big man who slept beside a radio and woke ready to use it on people who could not fight back. He swung the muzzle across the room toward the line of the kept, toward the slowest and the softest of them, and he fired. The round caught the broken man. He was the slowest thing in the room, loose and unresisting between Reeves's good arm and the shoulder of the thin man, his feet on the floor and never his weight, and he took the bullet high in the chest and folded without a sound. The same silence he had carried for 3 weeks. No cry, no word, just a long, slow giving way, and the two men holding him went down to their knees under the sudden dead pull of him. John fired twice, 2 rounds, a hand's width apart, dead center of the chest, the economy of a man who counted every shell he owned, and spent these 2 without a flicker because there was nothing else in the world they could be spent on. Brother Thomas stopped like a man who had walked full speed into a wall. The rifle fell out of his hands and clattered on the plank. He went down backward through the same blanket he had come through, and he did not move again. And the brother who had stood beside a radio and locked 7 people in the ground lay dead on the floor of the addition he had built his cruelty beneath. The gunfire stopped, and the ringing rushed in to fill the space where it had been. And under the ringing came the small sounds, a child's held breath, the scrape of knees on plank, the wet labor of a man trying to breathe through a wound that would not let him. Mark went down beside the broken man. Sarah was already there, her hands moving to the wound out of 19 years of reflex before her mind had finished telling them it was useless. And Mark watched those hands slow and watched them stop and watched them come away, because there was nothing in the kit, nothing on the earth for a wound built like that one. And the man on the floor was already going somewhere none of them were allowed to follow. His eyes had come off the middle distance for the first time since they found him. They were on the gray light standing in the open east door. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he had made himself stop believing in. Then the looking went out of them, all at once and quietly, and he was gone. 3 weeks he had not spoken a word. He had run for that exact door one time, and they had broken him for it in front of everyone he loved and made the rest of them watch. and he had died with his eyes fixed on the open door, a body's length short of it, on the one morning in his life it had ever stood unbarred. Mark knelt over him in the grit and the ringing and felt the word he wanted come up out of his chest and find nothing to climb out on. He bowed his head. He shut his eyes. Nothing came. It had not come for 2 weeks, and it did not come now, and there was no time left to kneel and wait on it. He opened his eyes and got to his feet, because the living were still in the room and the dead would have to be carried by the living or not at all. "We do not leave him," Mark said. The thin man and Reeves got their arms back under the body, and neither of them argued the point, because they were Camp Ridge people now, whether they had ever heard the name or not, and Camp Ridge did not leave a man in a hole or on a floor. Then the far door opened, the real one, the one that gave onto the sanctuary itself, and the man they called the shepherd walked into his own ruin. Pastor Emmanuel was not the thing a building like this should have produced, and that was the worst part of him. He was lean and gray and unhurried, dressed against the cold like any country preacher on a hard morning, and he came through the door with his empty hands held a little away from his sides, and his eyes moving across the dead enforcer and the emptied cellar and the armed strangers in his hallway, with the cool arithmetic of a man who had always, right up until this exact moment, been the one holding the better cards. He found Mark the way men like him always find the leader in a room, and he fixed on him, and he was not afraid. "You have made an expensive mistake," Pastor Emmanuel said. His voice was a pulpit voice, low and even, and long accustomed to being the last one anyone heard. "The people you are stealing belong to an arrangement a great deal larger than you. When the trucks come down tonight and find them gone, the men who own that arrangement will come looking, and they will not knock the way you." John laid the scope on the center of the man's chest, and Pastor Emmanuel stopped talking. Mark looked at him for a long second. He looked at the body 2 men were lifting off the floor, and the mother with her hand pressed over her child's eyes, and the cellar hatch standing open with its bracket and its beam, and every hard thing he owned rose up at once, and wanted to give Pastor Emmanuel precisely what Pastor Emmanuel had spent his months handing out to people who could not stop him. It would have been easy. It would have been fast. Not one man on that floor, and not one soul back at Camp Ridge would ever have called it wrong. He did not do it. "He comes with us," Mark said. "Bind his hands." He kept his own voice flat, because flat was the only thing he trusted himself to hold. "You know where the trucks come from, and where they carry people to, and who is waiting at the far end of it. You are going to give us every piece of that." He stepped in close to the gray, calm face. "And then you are going to stand in front of every human being you put under that floor and answer for what you did to them, which is a great deal more of a trial than you ever once gave a single one of them." He held the man's eyes. "But I will not execute a man whose hands are empty, not even you. Because the morning I do that is the morning this building wins, no matter who walks back out of it." Pastor Emmanuel studied him a moment longer, and something behind the gray calm shifted, because the man had spent his whole life reading rooms, and he could read that this one was already decided. He put his bound hands down in front of him and said nothing more. Mark turned away from him before the wanting could climb back up, and he made himself look one more time at the man on the floor being lifted off it, the man who had run for a door and been broken for the running, and he understood his own choice a little better for the looking. A bullet was the thing the shepherd had already given the broken man. A reckoning was a harder thing to hand a man, and it was the one thing left in the world that the broken man was still owed. There was movement at the rear of the sanctuary, low and fast, a third man breaking for a side door at the first clear sight of the rifles. Brother Amos, with no fight anywhere in him, and no loyalty that outlived the saving of his own skin. He was through the door and into the trees before Jake could do more than start the muzzle after him. "Let him run," Mark said. "We did not come for him. We came for them." Reeves had the dead man's weight shared with the thin man, but Reeves carried something none of the rest of them did, which was the whole inside of this building laid out behind his eyes. "Out the east door," he said, low and fast and certain, and the calm in the man's voice did more to hold the kept together than any order Mark could have given. "The same way we came in. Go." Then he looked at the open hatch and the heavy door at the foot of it. and the beam leaned against the wall beside the empty bracket. The beam these people had dropped into place 100 times to seal 7 living souls down in the dark. Reeves did the one thing his one good arm could still do that would matter. As the last of the kept went through the curtain and down the hall toward the open door, he hooked that beam with his good hand and dragged it across the doorway that gave onto the sanctuary and let it fall into the brackets on the addition side. The same beam, the same brackets. He sealed the shepherd's people out of the hallway exactly the way the shepherd had sealed the kept into the ground, and anyone coming after them now would have to come the long way, out the front and around across the open. The long way was minutes, and minutes were the only thing standing between 6 saved people and a convoy of trucks that did not yet know they were gone. Out, Reeves said, and they went out, the living, and the dead, and the bound, through the east door into the cold gray morning, breaking clean from a building that had kept human beings the way other men keep livestock in a barn. Segment 6. They came out of the addition into the open, and the 100 yards of dead winter grass between the building and the windbreak unrolled in front of them like a mile of the worst ground on earth. Sarah had the head of the line, and she did not let it slow, hauling the mother and the child and the older woman across the open at the ragged half-run of people whose legs had forgotten the shape of running. The thin man and Reeves carried the body between them, and the body cost them exactly what Reeves had said carrying a man would cost, every stride heavier than the one before it, the dead weight dragging at 2 sets of shoulders that had nothing left to give it. Jake came across the grass moving backward with the AR up, covering the front of the church and the side door Amos had vanished through, and the dark windows above, trusting his feet to ground he could not look at. Mark walked the bound shepherd ahead of him with a fist knotted in the man's collar and the Glock riding the small of his back. John came last of all, the scope rifle still up at his shoulder, the rear guard, a man who had already killed once this morning and had made his peace with doing it again if the building gave him a reason. Nothing came out of the building. The bar held the door, and the long way around was long, and for the length of that terrible open 100 yards, the church simply stood and watched them go. It was the longest 100 yards Mark had ever crossed. Out in the open with no cover, and a building full of dark windows at his back, every stride felt slowed, the dead grass grabbing at boots, the kept stumbling and catching at each other, the wrapped weight of the body sawing at the shoulders of the 2 men under it. Part of him kept bracing for the single shot that would drop one of them in the open and undo the whole morning. It never came, but the waiting for it lived in every yard of that grass. At the windbreak, Cobb had both trucks turned and pointed out and idling, and the scout was up on one knee at the tailgate with his rifle sweeping slow across the open ground and the white building beyond it. And in the covered bed of the lead truck, Casey had not moved. Through all of it, the shooting and the running and the dying, the dog had not once swung his head toward the church. He stood with his head over the rail and his whole hard body aimed at the timber east of the building, locked onto the trees, the low sound running steady and unbroken under his ribs, fixed on a thing not one of them could see, and not one of them had the time to go and find. Whatever stood in that timber had stood there the entire morning, and watched all of it, and done nothing at all, and the doing of nothing was its own kind of cold thing to carry away from that place. "Load them," Mark said. The kept went up into the covered bed of the lead truck, and Sarah handed them up one at a time and counted them under her breath as they went, the way she counted everything that mattered. The mother and the child, the older woman who had held her wrist in the cellar, the thin man, the 2 with the gray-sunk faces who had stopped marking the days. 6. 6 living souls where the cellar had held 7. Then the 7th went up after them, wrapped in a wool blanket Cobb had dragged from behind the seat, laid down full length in the bed, with a gentleness the whole hard morning had not allowed anyone to show until right now. 6 who would ride home breathing, and one who would ride home so that he did not have to be left behind in the dirt of a place that had already taken everything else from him. Pastor Emmanuel went into the bed of the second truck with his wrists bound, and John settled in across from him, and the scope never wandering far from his chest. Reeves pulled himself up into the back seat of the lead truck and sat back against it, gone gray again, the long night and the longer morning, and the dead weight of a man he could not save, finally surfacing in his face all at once. Casey came down off the rail only when Mark put a hand flat on his shoulder, and even then only halfway, his blocky head still swinging back around toward the timber as the tailgate swung shut on the bed. They broke out of the windbreak and back onto the county road and ran south hard for the gap in the sagging fence line, and behind them the church stood white and plain and silent under the gray sky, its enforcer dead on the floor, its shepherd bound in a truck bed, its cellar standing open and empty, its long, ugly secret carried away down a road the building had never owned. No one came out of it after them. Reeves's bar had bought back every minute he had promised it would buy. Mark put the lead truck up into the mouth of the cut, and the pines pressed in close on both sides, and the climb began, low gear and grinding, the trucks dragging their full weight of the saved and the dead and the guilty, up the rough blind track they had come down at first light believing it was theirs for one last time. They had been right about that. It had been theirs for one last time. And as the cut folded shut behind the second truck, Mark understood in his bones that the one last time was spent now, that this was the final morning the logging cut would ever carry Camp Ridge anywhere, that whatever the waking of a sleeping truck in the night had truly meant, the back door had just swung closed behind them for good, and they were on the inside of it with a gun parked across the only other way out. In the covered bed, the six living rode in a silence that was nothing at all like the silence of the cellar. It was the silence of people who had not yet found the words for being out, who did not trust the daylight not to be taken back. The mother held the child and rocked her, though the truck rocked them both already, the old reflex of a body that has only one comfort left to give. The older woman sat with her face tipped up to the gray light coming down through the canopy, as though she had genuinely forgotten there was such a thing in the world as open sky. None of them let their eyes fall on the blanket-wrapped shape laid in the bed among them. Every one of them knew to the inch where it was. Sarah rode back there with them and did the only work the morning had left her, which was to be a steady hand on a shoulder, a voice that did not shake, a person who would not flinch away from a single one of them no matter what the cellar had done to their faces. She did not tell them it was over, because she did not lie to people who had been lied to enough, and it was not over, and they were rolling toward a wire with an armored truck parked square in front of it. She told them they were safe right now, this minute, inside this truck, with these people, and that right now was a thing a person could put their full weight on. And one at a time, very quietly, some of them began to come apart in the particular way that people only allow themselves to come apart once they are finally somewhere they believe they will be caught. The thin man who had helped carry the body spoke once, low, to no one. The first words any of them had said since the cellar. He said he had counted 400 and some days down in holds like that one, moved one to the next in the dark, and that he had stopped believing a long time ago that anybody was ever coming for any of them. He did not say thank you. He only said it out into the cold air of the bed, the believing and the stopping both. And then he went quiet again, and Sarah put her hand on his shoulder, and the trucks climbed on. Mark drove, and he did not speak. The dead man rode behind his shoulder. The word that had not come for 2 weeks did not come now either, and he had stopped expecting it to, and he had not stopped wanting it, and he did not yet understand what the long distance between those two things was going to cost a man before this was finished. He knew only this much. He had walked into a building that kept people in the ground, and he had walked back out of it with 6 of them alive and 1 of them dead, and the man who had done all of it bound in the truck behind. And on the only scale a man can use when every easier scale has been taken away from him, that was a thing that had been worth the doing. The cut climbed toward the north ledge and the camp standing above it, and somewhere past the top of the grade, a 12-year-old girl was holding a rail with a sketch pad tucked under her arm, watching an armored truck that had not moved an inch since first light, waiting to count the trucks back in through the wire, and read out of that number alone who had come home and who had not. Mark put the lead truck at the last of the grade and felt the whole true weight of what rode behind him pull hard against the laboring engine, the living and the dead and the bound all at once, and he brought them up the final pitch of the cut toward the ledge, toward the wire, toward the camp and the truck on the bend, and whatever the long morning had made of them both, while Camp Ridge was 4 miles away, getting its people back. Segment 7. The trucks came up out of the cut onto the north ledge into the full gray daylight, and the camp had been watching for them since the first sound of the engines working the grade. Mark brought the lead truck up over the lip of the cut and onto the flat of the ledge, and through the windshield he could see the wire in the gatehouse and the whole camp strung out behind it, and he could see the people at the wire who had not gone, standing where they had stood since first light, watching 2 trucks come home where 2 trucks had left. Riley at the gatehouse, Gerald on the line, Calloway out in the open with his shotgun slung and his gray head bare to the cold. And at the rail, small and still in her oversized coat, a 12-year-old girl with a sketch pad tucked under her arm, counting. Emily counted the trucks first because trucks were the easy thing, and there were 2, and 2 had left. Then she counted the harder thing, which was the shapes inside them, and Mark watched her do it through the glass. He watched her eyes move over the lead truck's cab and the covered bed and the second truck behind it, and he watched the exact moment she understood that the number of shapes coming home was not the number the morning had left with. She did not run for the gate. She had never been a child who ran. She stood at the rail and held still and let the count finish. And then she found her father's face through the windshield and held on to it. And that was Emily. And it went into Mark harder than any running could have. They brought the trucks through the wire and into the gravel yard, and the camp closed in around them. Not loud. Camp Ridge did not do loud, and a morning with a body in a truck bed was not a morning anybody felt like making noise into. But they came, all of them, out of their sectors and their tents in the medical bay, because 2 trucks had gone down a blind cut into a thing nobody had been sure they would come back from. And they had come back, most of them, and the camp needed to put its hands on that and know that it was real. Calloway reached the lead truck first. He looked through the cab glass at Mark, and then at Sarah, and he read the whole morning off the 2 of them in a single pass, the win and the cost of it both. And he did not ask the question out loud because the answer was already laid out under a wool blanket in the bed of the truck. He opened Sarah's door for her himself. "How many?" Calloway said, low. "6 alive," Sarah said. She did not look away from him for the rest of it. "1 we could not save, and the man who did it, bound in the second truck." Calloway shut his eyes a moment. Then he opened them and became the thing the camp needed him to be, which was the one man who knew what came next when nobody else could make themselves move. "The bay is ready," he said. "Eleanor has had it ready since the hour you left. Get the living inside and get them warm." He looked toward the second truck and the bound gray figure sitting in the bed of it under the steady line of John's rifle, and something crossed the old preacher's face that Mark would not forget. "We will deal with that one," he said, "when the living are seen to." Mark came down out of the cab and his legs took a second to remember the ground. Emily was there. She had come down off the rail after all. The one time in 1,000 she let her feet move before her head had cleared it, and she crossed the gravel and put her arms around her father's middle and held on, hard and silent, her face turned into his coat. Mark put a hand on the back of her head and held her there and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was bigger than the holding. She had stood a rail for hours watching the thing on the road and counting an empty road behind it, waiting to learn out of a number alone whether her father was coming home. He let her have as long as she needed, which was not long, because Emily did not break for long. Then she stepped back and looked up at him with both eyes dry and steady, and she gave him the thing she had been holding to give. "The truck moved," she said, "while you were gone. It came up closer, and it stopped. And then there were men in the trees behind it. A lot of them." She did not make it dramatic. She reported it, flat and exact, the way she reported everything. "I have been watching the whole time. It is worse now than when you left." "I will look," Mark said. He squeezed her shoulder once. "You did right to count. Now go help your mother and Grace with the people in the bay. They have had a worse morning than any of us, and they need the kind of steady that you are good at." They brought the 6 into the medical bay where Eleanor Briggs had her cots and her gauze counted by the inch, and a stove run up hot against the cold, and Grace came in behind them with an armful of blankets, and Olivia came with tin cups of broth held careful in both hands, and the camp did the one thing that the white building 4 miles south had twisted into a horror. It gave these people sanctuary, the real thing. The Kep came in off the trucks blinking and flinching, braced down to the bone for the next bad thing the way the cellar had taught them to brace, and the next bad thing did not come. What came instead was a warm room and a dry blanket, and a girl pressing a cup into their hands, and a quiet voice telling them to drink it slow. The mother sat on a cot with the child still held hard against her, and would not put the child down, and nobody asked her to. The older woman who had gripped Sarah's wrist in the dark sat where she was set down and stared into the open door of the stove, and wept without a sound, and Grace lowered herself onto the cot beside her, and did not say a word, because some griefs have nothing to be said to them. They only have somebody willing to sit there while they happen. The thin man took his cup in both hands and looked at the steam coming off it for a long time, like a thing he did not trust. And then he drank, and his shoulders came down half an inch, and that half inch was a man beginning, after 400 and some days, to believe he was somewhere the door would not open in the night. Mark stood in the doorway of the bay and watched his camp fold itself around 6 broken strangers, and he understood in a way the morning had carved into him exactly what a sanctuary was, and exactly what it was not. It was not a cross on a gable. The church had owned a cross. A sanctuary was a warm room full of people who had decided that the hurt of a stranger was their own business, and the church had owned none of that at all. The child in the mother's lap had not made a sound since the cellar, the same trained stillness that had turned Mark's stomach in the dark. And for a long while she only watched the room with the flat, wide eyes the hole had given her. Then Olivia, who was not so many years past being small herself, crouched a little distance off and set a tin cup on the floor between them and left it there, the way a person leaves a thing for an animal that has learned to fear hands. And after a long minute, the child reached out one thin arm and took it. It was nothing. It was a cup. But the mother put her face down into the child's hair and her shoulders shook, because her daughter had reached for a thing in the open without being told it was allowed. And that was the first brick of a wall the cellar had spent its days tearing down. They took Pastor Emmanuel out of the second truck with his hands still bound, and they put him under guard behind a barred door, and the plain irony of a shepherd shut in the cold dark was lost on no one in the camp and spoken aloud by no one. He went without a fight. He had stopped talking back at the church the moment John laid the scope on his chest, and he had not started again, and he watched the camp move around him with the same cool reading eyes he had turned on his own ruin, a man already working the next angle out of the only habit he had left. Mark posted 2 on him, and told them plainly what the man was, and what he had done under that floor, and he told them the man talked for a living, and that they were not to listen to one word that came out of him. Then he left him in the dark. What to do with Pastor Emmanuel was a question that belonged to some other day. The man knew where the trucks came from, and where they carried people to, and who waited at the far end of the road, and all of that would have to be drawn out of him in time. But not today. Mark did not have it in him to weigh out a man's fate on the same morning he had knelt over a man's body. And a decision made tired and made angry was a decision a camp paid for later. The shepherd would keep. The dark would hold him the way he had held others, and Camp Ridge would decide what he was owed when its hands had stopped shaking. Riley found Mark by the bay with his green notebook already open, because Riley's grief came out as arithmetic and always had. 6 more, he said, not unkindly, just true. 6 more mouths on a camp that was already counting its cans by the shelf. 6 more bodies behind a wire that was already too long for the hands holding it. He was not arguing against the morning. He had stood and said amen over the dead man with the rest of them. He was only doing the thing a camp needs somebody to do, which is to say the cost out loud so nobody gets to pretend the right thing came free. We did the right thing, Riley said, and we will pay for it all winter, and both of those are true at once. Mark took it the way it was meant. We will find the cans, he said. We did not drive down that cut to do the cheap thing. Put them on the roster, and we will make the numbers come out." They laid the broken man out in the yard in the gray light, and Sarah closed his eyes with 2 fingers, and the camp came and stood. There was no time to dig and to bury, not with armor on the road and a prisoner in the dark and the day not yet half spent. But there was time to stand, and they took it, because a man who had been kept like livestock and had died, reaching for an open door, was going to be stood over by people who knew that his name had been a man and not a number, even if they never learned the name itself. Calloway prayed. He stood over the body with his bare gray head bowed and his shotgun slung at his back, and he prayed the way he always prayed, plain and unhurried and certain, no performance anywhere in it. A man speaking to God about another man the way you speak to someone you trust about someone you have just lost. He gave the broken man back. He asked that the running this man had done for that door 3 weeks ago and again this morning be counted at the last as a thing that had finally arrived somewhere, even if it had not been allowed to arrive here. He said amen, and the camp said it back to him. Lo, all of them but one. Mark stood at the edge of it with his head bowed and his eyes shut, and the word would not come. It had not come at the church over the body, and it did not come now over the ground they would open when there was time for it, and he stood in the middle of his own camp surrounded by people saying amen, and could not find the smallest piece of it anywhere in himself to say. He did not know what had closed in him over these last weeks. He only knew that it was still closed, and that a good man lay dead at his boots because the world had a church in it that kept people, and that somewhere down inside the silence where his prayer used to live was a thing he was going to have to turn and face on some morning that was not going to be this one either. Later, when the living were warm and the dead was covered and the prisoner was shut in the dark, Sarah found Mark by the trucks, and she did not say anything either. She just stood next to him and put her shoulder against his arm and let the weight of her lean into him, and he leaned back, and the two of them stood there in the cold and held each other up the way 19 years had taught them to, without a word, because words were for problems that had answers. They had brought 6 people home. They had lost 1. They had a man in the dark who needed deciding, and a road filling up with a thing neither of them could stop. None of it had an answer yet, and the only thing either of them could do was stand here a minute and be the wall the other one leaned on, and then go back to work. After a while, Sarah straightened and wiped her face once with the heel of her hand and went back to the bay, because there were 6 people in it who needed her more than her husband did just then, and Mark watched her go and loved her for the going. He found John alone at the edge of the yard, with the scoped rifle broken open across his knees, and his hands doing nothing at all, which for John was its own kind of alarm. John Moon's hands were always doing something. Mark sat down on the cold ground beside him and let the quiet sit a while, and then he said the only true thing he had. That man was going to kill the girl at the front of that line, he said. You did what put a stop to it. There is no version of this morning where you stand still and those people live. I know it, John said. His voice was even. That is not the part. He turned the rifle a little in his hands. I have been close to it before. Walk men right to the edge of it. This is the first time it was me who did the thing, and the first time it was clean, and not one part of me is sorry, and that is the part that sits wrong. He looked out toward the wire. A man is supposed to feel something afterward, and I went looking for the feeling, and it is not there. He was a brother of a church that kept people in a hole, and I keep waiting to be sorry that he is dead, and I am not. You are not supposed to be sorry, Mark said. You are supposed to be careful that it stays that way, only for the men who earn it. He put a hand on John's shoulder. That is the line. Not whether you can do the thing, whether you only ever do it to the one standing where Thomas was standing. You held it today. Hold it tomorrow, too. Reeves had come off the truck on his own feet and then very nearly not stayed on them, and Sarah had put him on a cot in the bay next to the people he had pulled out of the ground, which was where he belonged, and where the morning had bought him the right to be. He was Camp Ridge now. Nobody had voted on it, and nobody was going to need to. A man who walks back into the building that broke him, with one good arm, to drag 7 strangers up out of a hole, does not have to be told by anyone whether he belongs. Mark stopped at the foot of his cot, and the 2 men looked at each other, and neither of them said much. because there was not much that needed saying between men who had done that morning together. "You got us in," Mark said. "You got us out." Reeves shook his head once, slow and heavy. "We got 6, he said. And his eyes went past Mark to the open door and the yard beyond it, where the 7th lay under a blanket waiting on a grave, and Mark understood that Reeves was going to carry that one for the rest of his life, the way Mark carried the things he carried, and that this too, the carrying, was a part of what it meant to belong to this place. Outrow. It was Riley who came and found him because Riley had stood the wire the entire time the team was gone, and Riley was the man who had watched it change. "You need to see the road," Riley said. That was all. He did not have the kind of face that wasted words, and he did not waste any now. Mark went to the gatehouse rail with Calloway falling in beside him, and he looked south down Route 5 toward the bend. And the first thing he understood was that the armored truck had moved again. It had closed the distance. While the team had been 4 miles north hauling its people up out of a cellar, the MRAP had rolled forward off the mark it had taken in the night and come up the road closer to the wire than it had ever sat, close enough now that the bone-pale glass and the dark slits along its flank were details and not a silhouette, the heavy tires square on the center line, the plow riding low to the asphalt. It sat there in the flat gray daylight with its engine cold and its weight gone down into the road, patient, and it was no longer alone. Behind it, back down Route 5, where the road ran on toward the county line, the timber in the shoulders had filled with movement. Figures, vehicles. Mark counted what he could make himself count, and then made himself stop, because the counting only ran the one direction. Trucks pulled nose first into the trees, men moving between them with the slow, even purpose of people setting a thing up, rather than rushing a thing through. A second armored shape further back down the road that he could not make out clearly and did not want to. The reinforcements he had promised Calloway were coming in the dark had come instead in the daylight, and they were not charging the wire, and that was the worst of it, because men who charge are men in a hurry, and men in a hurry hand you their mistakes. These men were not in any hurry at all. They were massing. They were doing the slow, careful work of building the thing that would come through the wire when it was good and ready, on a clock that belonged from one end to the other to the man who had parked a truck on the bend 2 weeks ago and waited. "It is not today," Calloway said, low, reading the road the same way Mark read it. "They are still building." His jaw set under the gray beard. "But it has stopped being a question of weather." He moved the truck up to close the door, and now he is bringing the men who walk through it. And the Lord help us, we are going to stand here and watch him take his time about it. Mark stood at the rail and felt the shape of the whole day come down on him at once. They had driven down a blind cut and torn 6 living people out of a hole in the ground and carried one of them home dead and shut the man who did it in the dark. And it had been right. And it had been worth the doing. And not 1 inch of it had bought Camp Ridge a single hour of safety. The thing on the road had grown while they were gone. The cut was spent and sealed behind them. The road was closing in front of them, and the camp sat on its ridge between a sealed back door and a gathering army, with no good way left to run. He was turning from the rail to start the 100 things that had to start when Gerald said his name, low, careful, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning not to raise an alarm, 1 second before he was certain he had one to raise. "Mark." Gerald was not looking at the road. Gerald was looking at the dog. Casey had come off the truck and crossed the yard, and he had not settled, and he had not eaten, and he had not come to Mark's hip the way he came at the close of every hard day of his life. He had walked instead to the inner wire, the second line, the one that ringed the living heart of the camp, and he had planted himself hard against it, and he was locked on something out past it, not south, not toward the road and the armor, and the gathering men that every human eye in the whole camp was nailed to. The other way, north and high toward the dark stand of timber that climbed the ridge behind the camp, the ground that nobody was watching, because every gun Camp Ridge owned was pointed the other direction at the road. He stood the way he had stood in front of the church, his whole body gone to oak, cropped ears up and forward, his head low and level and aimed like a thing that had been sighted in. The sound came up out of his chest, the one that lived below hearing, steady and low and unbroken, and he did not move, and he did not look away. And when Mark crouched at his shoulder and laid a hand on him and tried to bring the blocky head around, the dog would not come off it. Whatever stood in that timber, the dog had found it, and the dog was certain of it. And there was not one man in the camp with the eyes to see what he saw, or the daylight left to climb up there and look. Every threat Mark Smith could put a name to was on the road in front of him. And the dog who had been right every single time, in the church timber and on the bend, and at the eastern breach before that, was telling him in the only language he had that the threat with a name on it was not the only thing coming for this ridge. Mark stood up slow at the inner wire with his hand resting on a dog that would not be moved, and he looked at the empty dark line of the timber climbing the ridge behind his camp, and he felt the back of his neck go cold. Behind him, the road was filling with an army he could see. In front of the dog stood something he could not.
This is not over.